Hi, my name's Claire Atherton and I'm the host of Beating BDD, a new podcast about body dysmorphic disorder from the BDD Foundation in the UK. For episode 6, I chatted to Alanah Bagwell. If you've seen anything about BDD in the UK media, you may well have come across Alanah. Having suffered severely for several years before getting treatment, she's on a mission to help others in two important ways. One, by talking about her experiences to raise awareness of the disorder, and two, by studying to become a clinical psychologist. Welcome to the podcast, Alanah. Thanks very much for agreeing to come in and share your story.
Thank you for having me.
So I feel slightly today as if I'm in the company of a BDD celebrity, because I think anyone who's seen any media in the UK about BDD may well have seen or heard from you before. What's it been like sharing all your experiences so openly?
That's a tough question. It's been difficult. I think people often see me on TV and they say, oh, you did really well and, you didn't seem anxious at all. But it is still really hard for me. I think it's hard for anybody to do it, let alone someone with BDD. But for me, it's been so important to do because I spent a long time misdiagnosed, not knowing what BDD was, not knowing what was wrong with me, essentially. And it was because of other people's media campaigns, that I found out what BDD was, and that started my route to recovery. So I feel that I owe something back, and if it helps one person, then that's a job well done, and it's worth the anxiety and the difficulties that come with doing it.
Yeah, no, I can understand how the motivation is so strong then, given your experiences. The thing I was really struck by was in the documentary on Channel 4, Nobody's Perfect, where you agreed to undergo a photo shoot with Rankin, the photographer. Where did you get the courage from to do that?
Yeah, that was a tough one. I think you can probably see within the documentary, for people that have seen it, that I was struggling a lot with it. And I know that the other people that took part were struggling too. And I think you see the end where they unveil the pictures and all the other participants were, oh my God, it's amazing. And I felt awful because it was Rankin, who is an incredible photographer. And I was there thinking, I hate it. I look absolutely disgusting. And sometimes I look back at it and I'm like, actually, it's not a bad photo, and other times I see it and I absolutely hate it. But it was tough to do. It was really tough. Yeah,
but can you at least sort of recognise the bravery that it must have taken? You congratulate yourself for having been courageous enough to do that. I mean, it is.
Yeah,
it is
no,
amazing.
I am really proud of doing it, and I think it was a big step for me in recovery. I think it was the first sort of media thing I actually did, and a lot of the other stuff was because of that or after that. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock because I think when I first found out about it, I'd gotten an email from someone working at the BDD Foundation that they'd been contacted. And I was so honoured that the documentary team had actually thought about including somebody with BDD. And I thought it was such an opportunity. And obviously we know, or some people may know, about exposure therapy. And I thought, well, what a better way of doing it than taking part in that.
It's the ultimate exposure, isn't it?
Exactly. Thankfully, they were really helpful actually at the studio, because I was surprised to find how many people there actually are involved in a photo shoot. And Rankin, while I was there, did take, he said, well, everyone else that's not here, get away. And it was just me and him, which did make it a lot easier.
Yeah. So before we came on to start recording, we were chatting just about what you're doing with your life these days, which seems extraordinarily different from what you were doing sort of 10 years ago, for example. What can you tell us about what you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, so, going from being housebound and truant from school and having a school welfare officer in school because I wasn't attending, I've since graduated from my undergrad at university in psychology, and I'm now studying for my master's at UCL. It's a master's in developmental psychology and clinical practice, and I'm hoping to go on to study to be a clinical psychologist.
Fabulous. Is that a route you think you would have chosen otherwise, or how much do you think your BDD experience has influenced that?
Yeah, definitely not, in positive and negative ways. Ever since I was a child, I wanted to go into medicine and I wanted to be a doctor. And because I was off school for about 5 years, I took my GCSEs without being at school. They came back okay, but my A-levels, it was a bit too difficult to do without attending school, essentially. So whilst my grades were pretty impressive for someone who had been in about 20% of the time. It wasn't good enough to get into, medical schools. I got rejected. And it was the day that results came back, and I said I could take another year out and reapply next year and get my grades up. And then I thought, I don't want to be spending more time off of school and more time getting behind, because all my friends were already off at university at this point or working in jobs. So I said to myself, well, I'll go to university, I'll see what place I can get through clearing just on the day, whatever places they have spare, they give out. And I got offers for psychology. I chose the uni closest to home so I could still have the contact with my family. And I said, well, I can do a postgrad medicine degree. And since doing the psychology degree, I decided that I wanted to go into psychology, partly because of my BDD and my experiences, and partly because I just fell into it because of the BDD.
Yeah. Could we go back then to when BDD first appeared in your life? What can you tell me about how that happened, how it manifested itself and the impact it had on your life?
Yeah, so I was about 13, and it wasn't obvious to me. Well, I didn't even know what BDD was. I started off being at school. I started to feel more anxious. I noticed sort of people in the older years, and in big groups in the playground or whatever you call it in secondary school, and they would be talking, and I just assumed everything they were saying was about me. If they were laughing, I assumed they were all laughing at me. I would constantly be looking into these big windows. I remember these big windows, and every time I walked past them, I had to look at myself. I would go to the bathroom and I had certain checks, check that there's not toilet paper on my shoe, check that my skirt wasn't tucked in, sort of anything to avoid sort of social embarrassment or people laughing at me or anything like that. And it got to a stage where I didn't even realise at the time. I thought this was sort of just normal behaviour. And then one day I said to my mum, I'm ill, I really don't want to go in, I don't want to get out of bed. And she thought, that's fine, you can have the day off. I wasn't that sort of person that would just take the day off for no reason. And then one day led to the next, and it just got more and more impossible to go in. And I just stopped going to school altogether. Some days I would try and go back in, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to get back into school. And I think during this time I'd been self-harming, I'd been spending a lot of time in my room, on the internet, and I'd often Google things, like I'm so ugly, plastic surgery, all these things. I remember there was a social media thing at the time where people would ask anonymous questions. I don't know if it's still going on. If it is, then I really hope it gets shut down. And I would post that, and often, as people do, it would lead to people sending you abuse. And my mum said, well, why are you on that? It's awful. But I would take, if anyone said, oh, you're so ugly, I would just immediately take that as of course, that's exactly, that is confirming my beliefs. There were lots of other things at the time, started using more makeup, started worrying more about the clothes I was wearing, the way I was doing my hair. And it really just got to a stage where I was barely leaving the house at all. That's where it really, really started to deteriorate.
So how long would you say that period was when you were pretty much housebound then?
I think altogether it was about five years. But following that, it wasn't like I was back to full functioning in full-time schooling. It was sort of like a slow, gradual increase from there. But yeah, because I missed from year 10, I think I stopped going to school. Then I did my GCSEs without going to school, and I was still at the same timings as my cohort. And then I tried to get back in for my A-levels, because each September would come round and I'd say, oh, well, this is the year, I'll try again and I'll get in this year. And then I made it for two weeks or something. I'd try my hardest, I'd really push myself. And then, after the 2 weeks, I would just be exhausted and I just stopped going in. And that happened a couple of years until I eventually got treatment and started to, started to get better.
So how many hours were you spending at home then? Pretty much. Were you literally always at home?
So I was at home pretty much all the time. Sometimes I would be able to, my family would be able to convince me to go out if it was like a family birthday meal, or if friends were having parties and there was alcohol involved. Sometimes I would be able to make it to that, which led to a lot of people in my year questioning my friend, oh, how come she's not at school but she can come to parties? And I said, well, because alcohol helps. And then my mum started to realise that obviously being at home, we still didn't have a name for what it was. She thought I was, she knows what depression is, and she just assumed it was depression. And she knew obviously it wasn't good being in bed. So we did try to start doing like little day trips, whether it was just her getting me into the car and we'd just go for a drive. And those were really beneficial. But generally I was in bed or watching a lot of daytime TV. I'm an expert on daytime TV. Or sleeping, yeah.
So how did your family react then? I mean, did they encourage you to go to the doctor or try and get some help?
Yeah, so at first it was extremely kind of volatile situation within the family, lots and lots of arguments, different people not being able to understand why I couldn't go in. My dad, we'll just get up and just go in. Or my mum really, really trying to help me, and me wanting to go in deep down, because I think often you have these sort of two struggling sides of your brain, because I wanted to be at school. People would say to me, I'm so jealous you get to stay off school. And I said, the place I want to be the most is back at school and living a normal life. So I'd have arguments inside my head, and then my mum would try to help me get to school. And I remember there'd be times where I'd, spend however many hours doing my makeup, and I'd finally get to the stage where, okay, fine, I'll go. And then I'd get into the car and I'd say to my mum, no, I can't go. And so she'd turn around. Then we'd get back to being nearly home. And I would suddenly say, oh, no, I really want to be at school. And then, turn around and take me, please. Then when you get near to school, my anxiety would just build. I'd have a panic attack and say, no, I'm not going in. That would happen some days. We'd drive back and forth to school 8-10 times a day. And each time it would get, my mum would get more and more angry at me, purely because she was having to drive back and forth, sort of like, make your mind up, pick one. And yeah, my mum had noticed that I'd been self-harming. So she did sort of start to say, right, we need to get some help, particularly when I'd stopped going to school. So we went to the GP. And originally we just went, Mum said, she's been self-harming. There's obviously something wrong. So they referred to CAMHS, which... yeah, that was an interesting experience. I was referred to CAMHS. I went for the initial assessment, told them I was suicidal and that I wasn't leaving the house. They said that they didn't think I had depression, so I wasn't giving any support for the depression side of things, no antidepressants or anything like that. They said, we're going to give you family therapy. They believed, because my mum had previously had a diagnosis of breast cancer, which is all fine now, that was what the issue was, and that was what was causing everything, even though I constantly said, I don't think that's it. I need some more support and some help. And every week when I could make it, because often I would miss sessions, I would spend 4 hours getting ready. I think it was a Thursday we would go. And my mum would take me, my dad would come from work, because he'd take time off work. And we'd go and we'd see 2 social workers for that family therapy. And we tried, and it just wasn't helping me, because, it's not the right thing for what I had. And we'd have arguments. I'd say it's pointless going. And my mum would say, come on, we have to go, because I think that was the only support she was getting. She said, at least it's something. So she was desperate for me to get there. And it got to a stage where we realised it wasn't really doing anything. And I think it was at this point that when I was up in my room, which I spent a lot of time in my room Googling, like I said, I think I'd Googled, I'm so ugly that I want to die. And the third link down maybe was a link to the BDD Foundation website, because there was less media stuff now. I think probably if you Googled that now, there'd be much more stuff. And I sort of started to read through other people's stories and experiences, and I could really resonate with the things they were saying. And, they had the checklist of symptoms and even stuff that I hadn't even picked up on myself doing, because I just thought that's part of daily routine. That's what I do. I suddenly realised, oh my God, yeah, I overuse cosmetic products. I use makeup. I spend a long time getting ready. I pick my skin. And I suddenly like, oh my God, these things aren't normal, and maybe that's why I'm feeling so horrible all the time. And then my mum said, right, well, we're desperate now. We started to look more into BDD. We bought a ton of books. And there was actually a massive sense of relief from my family at this point, because we'd been having constant arguments and fights, and suddenly we had a sort of a name to put to it, because there were times where my mum was so desperate she'd think, we're not a religious family at all, but she told me she started to contemplate, do we need an exorcism? It was just so we had no way of explaining it. And then with CAMHS telling us that there was not really anything wrong with me, we were just looking for any reason. My mum made me take herbal remedies, which we don't normally, for some people that's something they believe in. We don't really believe in that. She made me try everything and anything because we were so desperate. And then after that, she decided to pay privately for CBT treatment. And I think I'm getting mixed up here because I think I was receiving private CBT treatment before I'd realised I had BDD, and they'd finally said, yeah, you definitely come under the diagnosis of depression, and I'd be given antidepressants, and they definitely started to help, lift my mood a little bit. And it was whilst I was seeing the CBT therapist that I'd realised what BDD was, and then we'd spoken to the CBT therapist, and she says, well, we're not particularly trained in that. There's not a lot I can offer you. It might be better that you go and seek other help from, better qualified people. And it was at that time that my mum had seen a newspaper article from a trial at the Maudsley. I think this was done a good few years ago now, looking at whether the treatment would help adolescents with BDD. So we went along to the Maudsley and had my assessment. And I remember that being just such an overwhelming day because it was the first time, because even though I'd realised by this point, maybe I do have BDD, and I did have a major concern, which was my nose at the time, even though it's sort of often a lot of things and it's changed over the years and stuff. But I'd never been able to tell anybody or say the words out loud what it was because I thought that if I'd said to my family, oh, it's my nose, that would be the only thing they would ever see. And they said, that's so stupid. Of course, tell us what it is. And they, my dad looked up most common BDD concerns and he'd list them off and he'd say, oh, well, is it your nose? Is it your skin? And I'd say, no, I cannot tell you. And it was at my initial assessment at the Maudsley that I'd managed to write on a piece of paper for the first time what my main concern was, which was a big kind of breakthrough, I think. And I think it's because I was so desperate to really give the trial and the treatment my all. And we were quite worried as a family because the trial was comparing whether treatment worked, which meant that one group of individuals got treatment straight away and one group got psychoeducation for a few months and then got treatment later down the line. And it was randomly assigned, and we were so desperate to be in the group that got the treatment straight away. And luckily I was, and then started receiving treatment there.
How long would you say it was before you actually believed the diagnosis really on your heart? Because that's a really big sticking point for a lot of people with BDD, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's some days where I still don't. So yeah, it's a tough one. I think that definitely something that I wasn't told was that the believing definitely comes so much later. It's this acting as if is so important for such a long period. Because I had a long journey because I was at the Maudsley, and then I didn't continue with the treatment because it was a 2-hour drive away for me once a week, and some weeks I wasn't able to make it, and it got to a stage where it all got too much, and I think there may have been a suicide attempt during that time, and I had a bit of a breakdown, and it just wasn't viable for me to continue with the treatment there. So I actually went to the North London Priory as an inpatient for 5 months the following year. That's when I really started to recover, and I think it was just that intensive support that you get there that I know I'm so lucky to have had, because I know a lot of people just wouldn't have been offered that or wouldn't have been able to have access to that, and I know how lucky I am. So yeah, believing in the diagnosis, like I said, there are some days I still don't. I spent a long time just acting as if like they tell you to do, and going through the exposures and, living your life as if you didn't have BDD. And I got to a stage where I was functioning quite well. I was, for me, quite well. I think comparing myself to a normal human being without BDD, I wasn't doing that well. But for me, I was doing well. I was getting into college maybe 20% of the time. I was seeing friends. I was sort of much more engaged with family life. So I would say I was getting towards a decent quality of life. And I still didn't believe that I had BDD. I still believed that I was just ugly and I just needed to change the way I looked. But I looked at it and I said, but actually look at the way your life is going. It's so much better. So even if you don't believe, you're living a much happier life. And since then, there have been times where I start to believe a bit more. And there are times where I just don't think about it at all. And there are times where I do think about it and I think, I'm such a fraud, and I am really ugly, and I do need the plastic surgery and all of that. But I think I'm still on the way.
And just the fact that you have days where you don't think about it seems huge.
It's massive. I think it's so strange to think about it because it's such a blur, that period of time. Like I've gotten confused with what came first and what didn't. And I think sometimes I often underplay quite how bad it was. You know, you describe it in kind of quite simple terms and you don't go into the really horrible moments that you've had. And it's quite a relief in a way to forget how bad I was, because my mum says, oh, look how well you're doing, like there's no way. And I forget sometimes because I'm comparing myself to myself yesterday or the day before or a few weeks ago. But if I compare myself to 5, 6, 7 years ago, it's absolutely incredible. And like you said, the days where I don't think about it, which are actually really common now, are just amazing. And I think that's the thing. Maybe I don't believe if I think. So if I think about it and I really think and I think, no, actually, I'm not happy with the way I look. But the point is that I don't have to think about it. You know, I can go through my days and I can just not think. And I think that's the best bit.
I wanted to ask you a question, actually, that someone emailed in to the BDD Foundation podcast email address, which I thought was quite an interesting question, which was about your relationship with your emotions when your BDD is bad. This person was asking, do people feel they're almost like hypersensitive to their feelings, or is there a numbness sometimes, sort of emotional numbness?
I definitely got both of those. There would be days. I think it's the. I mean, I know not everyone has a diagnosis of depression alongside their BDD, but I know it is very common. Of course, it is. When you have BDD, of course, you're going to end up being depressed, whether you have it diagnosed or not. And there would be days where I would just. I think I've slept for 18 plus hours in a day before. And just napped and watched TV and not spoken and just felt so numb and almost like I was dead but alive. Just really the lowest level of living you could be. Didn't feel a thing, didn't want to talk to anyone. There would be weeks that would go by and my mum would say, right, you really need to wash now. So she'd, force me to get in the bath and she'd have to wash my hair because I just did not have the energy to do anything. My mum would bring me drinks. She would bring me food. And had I been living alone, I just wouldn't have, there would be no way. I just wouldn't have been able to do anything. Just the thought of even getting out of bed to go to the toilet was impossible. But then there would be other days where my anxiety and my anger would be so high and I would get into, physical fights and arguments with the family and I've never felt so angry in my life about anything. And it was just the thought of having the BDD and thinking about all these things I wanted to be doing instead. And, this why me and why do I have to be so ugly and why can all these other people be okay? And why was I so unlucky to be the one person in the world that is this disgusting? And, I've done horrible things in rage. I've smashed up furniture. I've ripped the rearview mirror off a car windscreen. And when Dad took it into the car mechanic, he said, how have you broken this? It's literally impossible to break off, because they had to get the whole window replaced because it was literally fixed into the glass. And that was just absolute rage. Yeah, I've done some horrible things. And I look back and I've been a horrible person when I've had my BDD. And I think I felt so guilty for that at the time, because that's not me as a person. I'm probably the most, compassionate and empathetic person. But just, there is that real contrast between feeling absolutely nothing and feeling some of the most powerful emotions I've ever felt.
Yeah, very interesting answer. How are things with your family now? Because obviously you all went through the mill.
Yeah.
How's that affected your relationship?
We're a very close family, which I'm really lucky to have. I think sometimes, it's particularly with my siblings, we just ignore the fact, because I do look back on my younger brother. He's 5 years younger than me. So at the time he was, still very, very young, and he shouldn't have really, every morning before school, he would have to get himself ready because my mum would be focusing on me. And often I took a lot of the priorities, and he'd get jealous, obviously, because he was the youngest. Why are you making her breakfast and making her a drink and not me? And how come you do all this stuff for her? And he still brings it out sometimes to get his own way. But he had to see awful things. He had to see my mum having to rush me to hospital, or seeing me with blood dripping down my arm from self-harming and stuff. As 9, 10, 11-year-old really shouldn't have to see. But now, my siblings can make jokes about it, and we do. And we tend to not bring it up unless it's in a jokey way. But I think the biggest change has been with my mum. My mum and I have always been very close. And I think we would have been close without the BDD, but there's no way we'd have the kind of relationship that we have. She is my best friend. And often when I talk about my mum and how close we are to other people, they say, oh my God, you can tell your mum that. You do that with my mum and I are just the closest I think I'll ever be to anybody. And I think whilst I know we would have been close without me having had BDD, I think that's definitely something that came from going through the BDD together, because she was my main caregiver and my main support through everything.
Can you think of any other benefits and things that you've gained from these very difficult experiences other than this closeness with your mum?
I suppose one very, very superficial one is that I'm quite good at doing makeup, which is probably a really bad thing to say. But often people will say, oh my God, your makeup's amazing. Like, how do you learn to do that? And I'll say, 5 years of being housebound and spending 4 hours every day that I had to leave the house doing makeup. So definitely not worth it. Being close to my mum is definitely a much more important one. I think the route I've chosen, I think we discussed it a little bit earlier, the route I've chosen with education and my plans for the future, work-wise. I do want to train as a clinical psychologist, but I do have in the back of my mind that whether it will work out or not, I would love to work within the field of BDD in the future. I think that's a massive positive. I think, just realising how much I as a person can go through and come out the other side as well. I think when you think about it, there are lots of positives, probably.
Absolutely, certainly seems to have given you an awful lot of strength and compassion as well, and empathy, and all of those good things.
Yeah, no, definitely. This made me a much more, I think as well, because I think often you become quite ignorant to mental health unless you go through it yourself. And I'm now so open about mental health and so heavily involved in it and so interested in it. And I think I probably would have just gone through life not even being aware of mental health and not really understanding it like a lot of people do. And I think that's a positive as well.
Is there anything from all of the things that you did during your therapy that really has helped you and that you turn to when things are difficult?
I think the exposure, I know people say, I think the exposure work is one of the big ones. I think that's the most, I like it because it's practical. You know what you've got to do, and even though that's horrible, you can go and get it done. I think the exposure work is really, really important. But for me, I was lucky enough, like I said, to be at the Priory. So I got to, in the first few months, do exposure work with groups of people. Some of them had BDD, others had OCD, which was actually quite nice because even though we didn't relate on the shared things that gave us anxiety, we could relate on what it felt like and how awful doing exposures were. And because we didn't share the same anxiety-provoking things, we could actually do them with each other. So I could, if someone, for example, their OCD was around toilets or whatever, I could go and touch it with them and show them that, because that didn't make me anxious. And then they could come with me on the tube, whatever it happened to be. And I know that's a real privilege that I got. And I know that a lot of people don't necessarily have access to that. But even just having a friend or a relative, if you're lucky enough to have someone who is supportive to do it with you, I still feel much more comfortable when I was on holiday, for example, without wearing makeup, when I'm with somebody else who isn't wearing makeup. It just makes me feel a lot less alone, even if I know it doesn't make them as anxious as it makes me. Getting someone to do it with you.
Are there other kind of milestone things that you've been able to achieve because of the exposure work or any other things that you've done through the therapy?
Yeah, strangely, the first time I actually went without makeup properly was actually only a couple of months ago, which shows how long it takes to go through all of these things. Which I didn't ever think I'd be able to do again. I also, a couple of months ago, went swimming for the first time again because I used to actually swim competitively and I was really, really heavily into it. And I thought I'd never be able to get into a pool again. There's so many things. I thought everything I was doing was impossible. I didn't think I would ever get back to school. I didn't think I'd ever get qualifications. I didn't think I'd go to university. I didn't think I'd be able to make new friends, and I thought I would lose the friends I had, which some of them I have, some of them I haven't. Yeah, basically everything I'm doing every day I thought was impossible at one time.
Yeah, amazing. How do you actively keep yourself well now? Do you have any particular strategies?
Yeah, It's funny to think about, actually, because I'm trying to think now, the things I should be doing, which I'm not doing at the moment. Routine is really, really important, I've noticed. And I think this is the first time, so starting my master's, the first time I've actually consistently kept a routine. Because even at my undergrad, my attendance was extremely low and I would miss a lot of lectures, which I probably shouldn't be admitting. But this is the first time I've actually managed to keep a routine in the last few months. And this is the highest attendance I've ever had for anything since I was... since about nine years ago, which is amazing for me. Routine is really important to make sure you get out every day and you get up every day, because I know when I stay in bed, it's one day leads to the next. And, from there, it just goes downhill. But remembering that even if it does, you can still get back on track. And also just being really vigilant and knowing your triggers, because I've realised since moving to London and starting my master's, I'd gone from being makeup free on holiday, and I thought, I can just keep this up when I go back. And I've slowly, added things to my routine, and I've added, I'll just do a little bit more makeup, or I'll just add a little bit more mascara, or, I'll do this face mask extra. And you sort of I think you trick yourself sometimes. The BDD says, I'm not doing it because of BDD. I'm just doing it because I fancy it. And it's just being really, really aware of, actually, maybe I should just go with a bit less makeup today, and trying to sort of carry on with the exposures all the time. I'm always trying to do them, even though thinking about it now, I'm probably been a bit naughty recently. I should probably do some more. But yeah, just always thinking and always just using all the tools you've had in recovery. Is
there anything you know now that you wish you'd known before your BDD first appeared?
Yeah. Well, what BDD is, for a start, that it exists. And it's such a cliche, but that it does get better. I mean, there were stages where I didn't want to be alive. I would cry to my mum and I'd say to her, please let me kill myself, just let me do it. And I say to my family, you're being selfish by forcing me to be here. I am living the most horrible life. I don't want to be alive. And the only reason keeping me here is because I know that it would impact you guys so much. So you should just tell me that you'll be okay and let me go. And I've had discussions with my mum since, and she would question at the time, am I being selfish? Should I tell her, that, go and end it? Sorry.
Don't worry.
There were times where I just thought, there's no way I'll ever be happy. And that's it. And it does get better.
Now.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. And it's such a cliche thing to say, and I know people hear it all the time, but I've been there where, you don't think there's any possibility. And it does. It can.
So my final question then, I suppose, along those lines is, do you have any particular advice you would give to people who are now where you were in those worst days?
Yeah, that's such an interesting one. I think there's so many things I could say. I think holding in mind that it does get better, keeping any support that you have around you really close, and understanding that they may not ever really understand, but that they'll try their best. That's if you're lucky enough to have support. I know that can be a privilege sometimes. Really educating yourself around what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. I know it sounds really simple, but I think, I've stopped going to therapy now, actually, not because I've intentionally made that choice. It got to a stage where I would only book therapy when I felt I needed it, and I've just not felt I needed it. And I think it's because I'm so aware now I can give myself my own therapy. I know, you've started to use more makeup, maybe you should start decreasing your makeup, or, you should do this exposure or that exposure, and being creative with the exposures. What I've noticed from the work I've done with the support group for people with BDD is that often people really struggle to see how they can get from, for example, not being able to wear a certain item of clothing because it's tight, because they're wearing completely baggy clothing, to the tight piece of clothing, or going from a full face of makeup every day to not wearing any makeup. And it's not about going straight there. It's really breaking it down and being really, really creative about how you do that. So maybe you don't like wearing short sleeves, so you start off by maybe rolling your sleeves up a little bit. It's really about breaking down the exposures and getting creative about it.
That's fantastic advice, Alanah. Thank you so much for coming in. It's been really inspirational to hear you.
Thanks a million. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. Cheers. Wow, what an incredibly honest interview. Thanks again to Alanah for that. We hope to talk to her again next year, so watch this space. You can tell us what you think and keep an eye out for more episodes by following the BDD Foundation on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube and Facebook. We're also on major podcast apps like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher and Podbean. And of course, we're on the BDD Foundation website at bddfoundation.org. That's it for today. Until next time, remember the usual disclaimer applies. This podcast isn't therapy, so please do seek help from a trained professional. Thanks for listening.